Hello, everyone. My name is Amy, and I would like to welcome you to today's session, Navigating Global Regulations, Age-Restricted Questions and Research. But before I turn you over to today's speakers, just a few quick platform tips. First of all, this webinar is being recorded. You will receive a link to the recording in your email tomorrow. Secondly, we encourage you to ask questions both during and at the end of today's session. And you can do this by using the Q&A widget, which I will show you now. This is a look at your platform view. Please note the widgets at the bottom. There you will see the Q&A widget. This is once again where you will send your questions for today's speakers. They will be addressed at the end of today's webinar during the Q&A portion. There's also a group chat function where you can chat with other attendees. And lastly, there is a speaker bio widget where you can find out more about today's presenters and connect with them on LinkedIn. That's it for me. Without further delay, I'll turn it over to Esomar's president, Ray Poynter.
Hi, Ray Poynter here, and thanks for joining us. Today, we're going to be looking at navigating research globally, and in particular, age-restricted questions around the world in the context of research. And I'm delighted to be joined by Debrah Harding, Managing Director of the MRS, and Melanie Courtright, CEO of the Insights Association. And we're going to be sharing a piece of research that we've done collaboratively. The agenda today is, first of all, Melanie is going to start off with why we created this new guidance. I'm going to have a look at how the rules vary around the world. And then Debrah is going to be joining us to look at a case study of one country's approach, namely the UK. And then the three of us will have a look at the context and the future for this area. And then we're looking forward to a Q&A session where you'll all be able to ask your questions, and hopefully we'll be able to give you some answers.
Thank you very much, Ray. It's a pleasure to be here, and welcome to everyone who's joined us today. I'm very excited to talk with you for a moment about the background and objectives of this collaborative effort. First, I would remind everyone that as part of our core responsibilities as research, and no matter which association you're a member of or participate in, or which website you go to and look at our codes of ethics, all of us have a section around duty of care and research with children and vulnerable individuals. One of our most important responsibilities is to care for the participants in research and to make sure that no harm is done in any way, no matter their age or any other demographic variable. But most importantly, as we work with children and vulnerable individuals, we're reminded of how careful we must be as we collect the insights we need for the decisions that we're facing. There's also the implications of local and international law. There can be large differences all over the world. And even when you're working in a country like the United States, there can be differences among the states within the US. So just understanding your country law may not be enough. International law, country laws, and local laws can leave you with a complicated set of considerations when you're working with research that includes children. So finally, we're a global community. We often do global research. So when one of our members came to us and said that they could really use some advice and ideally a piece of information or a publication of some sort that would help them understand how they should consider research with children when doing a global project, we banded together as a group of collaborative associations to help answer the call. So with that, I'm going to hand you back to Ray Poynter, and he's going to talk to you about an overview of the rules across the world.
Thanks, Melanie. And the world indeed is quite a strange place. So I want to stress what Melanie just said. This is very much a collaborative effort. It represents 37 countries around the globe. That's 37 national associations who've joined together so that we can have this information coordinated by Esomar and GRBN. 4 key points. The world is a diverse place. Context matters again, and still the need to seek advice. So taking just one of the questions that we asked, at what age can you interview a child or young person without parental consent without personal data being collected, and it's not on a sensitive topic such as sexual activity, religion, drug or alcohol use. So this is the lowest bar entry point. And if we look at the USA, and as Melanie's just said, it varies a bit by state, but online, they must be at least 13 years old. There's also what happens if you're interviewing in a school to take into account. In the UK, it's 16, but you can talk to the MRS about a waiver if it's in the social good. In Indonesia and Netherlands, 12 years, younger again. New Zealand, Nigeria, Iran, India, Brazil, and others, it's 18 years. So really quite radical differences. And if we go to Thailand and Singapore, it's 21 years before you can talk to a young person about a non-sensitive topic without talking to their parents. So the world really is very, very different. Context matters. So taking another one of the questions, at what age can you interview a child or young person with parental consent, but we're not collecting personal data and it's not sensitive? In Mexico, 6, Kenya 7, Japan 13, Indonesia 6, and Australia 10. I've picked these because of the interesting ways that it changes as the context changes. So at what age can you interview a child with personal data, with parental consent, but it's not sensitive? And it stays the same in Mexico at 6. It stays the same in Kenya and Japan at 7 and 13. In Indonesia, it jumps up. We've moved the personal data. We've got permission, but it jumps up to 15. Australia, it jumps up to 14. We then go to the most sensitive one and we say, okay, you've got permission, but it's about a sensitive topic. And in Mexico, the phrase is not possible, but not possible means it has to be an adult, so it's under 18. Presumably not possible in Singapore. Thailand, for example, would have been 21 because that's the age at which you're an adult there. In Kenya, it jumps up. In Japan, it jumps to 18. In Indonesia, it jumps. But in Australia, it's the same as the middle category. So it's not just that different countries have different levels, but the stage at which they move from one category of constraint to another category of constraint changes. And of course, a definition of what is sensitive from one country to another varies. So another way of looking at context, Brazil, the age required without parental consent is 18, except for polls. Opinion polls, you can interview people at 16. In Thailand, now this will be true in lots of countries, but the Thai Association stressed this in their answers to us, as well as getting parental consent when interviewing a child or a young person, you must get their consent as well. Canada, you need to keep recordings of all research with children and keep them for a year. In India, no interviewing for topics like alcohol, smoking below the age at which those products can be used. And this is also true in other countries. In Egypt, there's no strict law covering the subject, but answers reflect market research practice to ensure there is no community reaction. The government will not approve sensitive issues in the questionnaire, and every questionnaire should have government approval. So we suddenly move into some other topics as well. Now, this information came from these 37 national associations a few months ago. It's going to be a really good guide to let you know that there are issues you need to be addressed, but it's not the definitive word. Talk to your local partners. Rules change. They change based on laws. They change based on court cases, and also regulation from the trade associations. And of course, custom and practice evolves. So please do seek advice. Now I'm going to hand over to Debrah, and we're going to look at a specific case based on the UK.
Thank you, Ray. So now I'm going to take you through a case study from the UK. I'm going to cover 3 topics: the MRS Code of Conduct Rules, consent waivers, which Ray has briefly touched upon in his presentation, and also some other considerations that we use when advising on children and vulnerable adults. So first up, the Code of Conduct Rules. Within the UK, an age of child is an individual under the age of 16. And members must ensure that permission of a responsible adult is obtained and verified before a child participates in their professional activities. Now, a responsible adult is an individual who has personal accountability for the well-being of a child or a vulnerable adult, for example, a parent, a guardian, a carer, a teacher, a nanny, or a grandparent. It is not an individual who has limited or specific responsibility, such as a lifeguard or an instructor or an employer. Also, where the permission of a responsible adult is required, members must ensure that the responsible adult is given sufficient information about the project to enable them to make a decision. And this can be very important, particularly in studies whereby there may be culturally sensitive questions and the parents or the responsible adults may be very unhappy about a child participating if they're aware that the subject matter is something that is culturally doesn't align with their beliefs. Members must also ensure that the identity of the responsible adult giving permission to approach a child to take part in their professional activities is recorded by name and relationship or role. Because again, this verifiable nature of the data is really, really important. So if there are issues or concerns, there is an auditable trail that can be fed back to how the permission was gained in the first place. It's also very important to remember that actually in certain environments, it can be quite difficult to confirm that a child has permission to take part in research. And so what the MRS code says in this regard is where it is known or reasonably to be known that participants may include children, members must ensure participants are asked to confirm their age before any other personal information is requested. Further, if the age given is under 16, the child must be excluded from giving further personal information until the appropriate permission from a responsible adult has been obtained and verified. And members must take special care when considering whether to involve children in projects. The project design must take into account their age and level of understanding. In all cases, members must ensure that children have the opportunity to decline to take part, even when responsible adult permission has been obtained. This remains the case if a project takes place in school. And members must ensure that information about other individuals is not collected from a child unless for the purposes of gaining permission from a responsible adult. So that's the rules that we have, but we also have something called consent waivers, and I'll give you a bit more information about that. So there may be occasions when obtaining permission into sensitive subjects would, for example, cause potential harm to a child. For example, the use of confidential helplines that might be talking to children about illegal activities like drug taking or alcohol abuse or smoking. In these cases, the requirement for permission may be waived, but only with the explicit prior approval of the MRS Market Research Standards Board. And members seeking to waive the requirements for permission of a responsible adult must make a written application to the MRS Market Research Standards Board containing a written statement outlining the ethical reasons why a waiver is required. For example, why this data collection process needs to be done, what harm or adverse consequences could be caused by asking permission of a responsible adult, and so on. A copy of the questionnaire, discussion guide, or other data collection instrument to be used, and the source of the sample, and any stimulus material, show cards, etc., that form part of the data collection process. And at that point, the Market Research Standards Board may refuse to grant a waiver. They might grant it in an unconditional waiver in terms of they're very happy with the way everything's set up and proposed, or they may grant a waiver subject to amendment of the methodology and or materials. And things like repeat or tracker projects must obtain a new waiver on each occasion they are run, particularly if there has been an evolution in mode or methodology that will have meant a change in the approach being undertaken. The advantage of waivers is it gives more flexibility to address things like researching sensitive topics, protecting participants, children as participants, if asking for consent might cause them harm. And also it is a way of the Market Research Standards Board also giving input into things like potential projects, approaches to mode and methodology and so on when talking with children. But it's not just the code and the waiver considerations that are important points in the UK. There are other issues to be considered. In the UK, we also have very detailed separate guidance, the MRS guideline, conducting data collection activities with children. And this provides much more contextual information around the MRS code guidance, such as detailed advice about the consent process and documentation that you need to consider, subject matter considerations of thinking about the sorts of things that you should and shouldn't be asking children, the data collection process, including interviews, when, where, the sorts of considerations you should be putting in place. Things like the suitability of different modes and the considerations you have for when using different modes like online, telephone, face-to-face and so on. The appropriateness of things like incentives and rewards and what you need to do regarding consent as well, and responsible adult consent if you are offering incentives and rewards. And you can see here, there's a link to the MRS detailed guidance that covers all of these points. But in the UK, there are also other legal considerations and guidance for data collection with children. First off, we have checking services for the protection of children and vulnerable groups. And what this entails is that if practitioners and researchers are undertaking a lot of research with children and have a lot of exposure to children, they must be checked legally to make sure that there are no criminal convictions or concerns which would indicate that such individuals shouldn't be able to approach and collect data from children. There's also the Information Commissioner's Office, which is the data privacy regulator in the UK. Their age-appropriate design code, so-called the Children's Code for online services. And what this does is it translates GDPR into design standards for online services likely to be accessed by children. So remember that point I was raising earlier about, if you're using different modes, particularly the online mode, and if you have a website that is likely to attract the under 16s, this guidance is really, really helpful by the Information Commissioner's Office. It talks about things like the kind of wording you should use, the kind of language you should use, what your consent statement should look like, and the sort of considerations of ensuring that you are not doing things like default opt-ins and so on, all of those kinds of things. So very helpful guidance. And MRS has interpreted this guidance for research in the MRS Age Appropriate Design Code guidance, and a link for that is also provided here. So it is a very complex picture in the UK. We are very conscious of the need to protect children, but we do have a comprehensive set of guidance to help practitioners when they're undertaking research with children in the UK. And I'm now going to pass back to Ray and Melanie as we consider some of the other issues.
So thank you, Debrah. Really good look at what's happening in the UK. And in looking at this work, we need to be aware of lots and lots of other trends and associated topics. And probably the biggest one globally at the moment is global data quality. And Melanie, do you want to say just a few words about global data quality and then perhaps link it to some of these concerns?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Thank you. If you're not familiar with the Global Data Quality Initiative, it's another great example of your global associations working collaboratively on an important topic on your behalf. Global data quality was put together by a group of associations responding to a critical point in time around data quality and fraud concerns. And it consists today of 9 associations all working together with different work streams. If you go to globaldataquality.org, you'll be able to pick up some great tools around survey design, end-link guidance, a glossary of the most important terms and how we should be using them. And there's more coming. CRIC has a new buyer's guide that's out there. The Esomar 37 questions is out there. It's a great tool, and we'll be aligning more of those over the coming months. The most important part of global data quality is that global data quality is a framework, a benchmark, a foundational element for the work that we do and for the trust and confidence in our profession. And certainly part of that is following guidelines and best practices around the age of participants when we approach them, thinking about the design of research around the age and vulnerable individuals. There's some of that in the Esomar survey, right, and in the Esomar guidance. So you'll want to consider all of those, take advantage of those tools, and become involved in the Global Data Quality Initiative. And as this initiative started, the initiative that we're talking about today around putting together an age guide, as it started with a request of one person who said, oh, I could really use some help. If you have a topic around global data quality that you could use some help on or that you think needs attention, we hope that you'll contact us and let us be involved in that process with you again. There are also other topics here, and I welcome Ray and Debrah to talk about demographics and quality and some of the other concerns around passive and AI.
Absolutely. So demographics and quality build on global data quality and issues like diversity. And Debrah, the MRS is very involved in global data quality, but also issues like diversity, and it's linked to demographics and the quality of surveys, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also that the important point is that in diversity and inclusion has no age limits. So all of the sorts of things that in terms of the consideration for inclusion that we have for working with adults applies also for children. And I think even more so in terms of some of the evolving issues within society where they are more likely to affect children and can be hugely complex. So things like gender identity and so on, a very, very complex topic, but is something that is more likely to be affecting more children as a community. And whether you can ask those kinds of questions, again, in some countries it's not legal and so on. So this is where your national associations can be really, really helpful because they'll have the information and experience on the ground as to what is acceptable within country borders.
So we've been talking about getting explicit consent in most of what we've talked about today, but there are a couple of areas. Social media is one. Passive data collection, maybe where we're gathering information from mobile phones where we might get permission, but it's much harder to know if somebody is 13, 16, 18, 21, whether the topic is sensitive. So anybody involved in this social media data collection or passive data collection, it all becomes more complicated in terms of permission. And one of the things we're seeing in the AI Act that's just been passed by the European Union is that biometrics, including facial scanning, eye tracking, are going to be much more regulated going forward. So that's going to be another concern around those topics. And there are guidance from all the trade associations and from Esomar on things like social media data collection. It's important to think about those in the context of young people, vulnerable people, and people in general.
The laws in this area are actually changing pretty rapidly too. Here in the US, the laws are changing even around what age people can be before they're having social media accounts. So if you're collecting data from social media or passively, you're really going to want to follow the guidance of your local association around making sure you have proper governance and provenance, making sure that you've done a really good plan on the rules and regulations around what you're doing, and that those conversations are held in the context of the most current laws in each jurisdiction.
Yeah, I totally agree. And similarly in the UK, the whole area of research and data collection with children is really, really live. And there are lots of the different regulators within the UK looking at different aspects of this. And so, things like whether you can use default privacy and geolocation settings, whether you can profile children for targeted advertisements, what you can and cannot do with children under the age of 13, because that whilst we have the 16 as the cross point in terms of the age of a child, also in terms of different engagements with children, there are kind of like a tiered approach, and 13 is one of the key thresholds for different things with children. So, and it is just it's such a big area. One of the interesting things, going back to Ray's point about harms as well, is that we had some research done in the UK where over a 4-week period, Ofcom, which is the communications regulator in the UK, they did some research, and over a 4-week period, they identified that 62% of children aged 13 to 17 reported encountering some kind of online harm, while many considered it an unavoidable part of their lives online. And that kind of context, that kind of environment is a reason why the regulators are so keen to introduce more guidance and more statutory sort of approaches to protecting children.
Absolutely. And then the one where we have no answers, we do have some questions between the three of us. AI and synthetic data, at its best, it could protect anonymity, but maybe it would lead to the inadvertent disclosure of people. What about age-specific avatars doing the interviews? If the learning has been done from young people aged under 13, say, is that data permissible, even though we didn't do any learning from people under 13? If we create synthetic people under the age of 13, would that be an ethical thing to do? I think these are some of the questions which we will need to be considering really over the next couple of years because it's moving so fast.
I agree. And the concept of do no harm, while it's an important construct for the collection of data, it also applies to what we do with the data and how the data is used for decision making in the world around us. So even if we create synthetic data and it's permissible and it's legal and it's licensed and it's ethical with the way that we create data and it's fit for purpose and it's sound, how we use that data in the world around us can still cause harm to children and vulnerable individuals. So there's still much to consider, even if we get the data collection right perfect around the age construct.
Absolutely, I totally agree. And I think the thing as well is with synthetic data, depending on what type of synthetic data it is, but for a really good synthetic data to be created, it needs to draw upon excellent primary data that as part of the modelling. So that means that's a use of children's data, potentially, which is then used to create the synthetic data. So there's also considerations regarding data privacy and data use and consent. All of those issues, they still apply to synthetic data, particularly when you've kind of got you're using models that are based upon primary data. And I think also the other point as well, which is really, really important, is that is the transparency and making it clear that if you are creating synthetic children's data, that it's clearly tagged as synthetic, so that it's not being confused or conflated with real children and potentially causing them harm. So there are lots of ethical issues. It is not going to be a dull future, Ray.
Absolutely. And with that, we're all going to turn on our cameras and we look forward to reading and answering your questions. So hi there, everyone. We've got some questions already, and I think some have been answered to some extent. There was a question about were the rules available in the document for the US, because I quoted various other countries. There are 37 countries in the report which you can download, and yes, the United States is in there, the UK is in there, Uruguay is in there, France, Germany. Fantastic range of countries. I'll jump on the next one, and you might want to come in as well, Debrah. There was a question, are there EU regulations applicable to all the EU countries regarding the collection of information with and without parental permission? We've got quite a lot of background noise from somewhere, hopefully it's not me. But there are regulations in every country, and they are not the same. There probably are 2 or 3 countries that will have the same, but it'll be by accident. But as soon as you go to sensitive topic, the age at which you can have sex, the age at which you can smoke, the age at which you can drink alcohol, the age at which you can drive and do all sorts of other things differs from country to country within the EU. And likewise, the UK is going to be another difference there.
Yeah, I think also a key point is that whilst there is not, if you like, a specific piece of EU regulation that is about children and collecting children's data, Data Protection Act and which is the domestic legislation in the UK, but which is based upon the EU General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, does specifically identify children within the legislation, and it defines a child as under 16, with also special consideration needing to be applied for those that are under 13 as as well. So whilst there isn't a specific piece of legislation, GDPR basically applies in all of the essential ways. So that means things like specific protection must be in place when using personal data from children. Your consent is required from those holding parental responsibility, which is what the GDPR says, that is you can only kind of collect data from children except in cases of accessing or preventing harm. And when communicating with children, it should be in clear and plain language. Consider risks of undertaking any activities with children. So all of those things which are within GDPR apply to data collection from children as well.
Yeah, and the last thing I would say for Jana, if it's not clear yet at this point, we asked each of the countries, the 37 countries that participated, a set of 6 questions. Each of those 6 questions were 3 different scenarios, both with and without parental consent. And we asked what age it's permissible to do each of those 3 scenarios, both with parental consent or without parental consent. So the guidance is going to give you many countries in the EU, and it's literally going to show you at what age it's permissible based on information directly from the local associations. So the guidance is going to be your best friend in terms of an overall guidance. But then again, we're recommending that you take that guidance and you still work closely with your local associations if you're doing something that is and has any chance of having any type of sensitive data that the government might care about. So just make sure. But that guidance is available now. I'm sure we're going to share the link, and you can grab that guidance and have those specific scenarios for all 37 countries.
So we have an interesting comment, really, a little bit of a question as well from India, bringing up the topic, which certainly both Melanie and Debrah spoke about, which is vulnerable adults as well need special attention. They're not covered by this study, but it would be good to have another comparative study at some point in the future. And also, that raises the point about research that is funded from a non-Indian organization has to go through a specific approval process. We've not covered that in this study, but I am aware of it, and it's a growing trend. We're seeing moves a little bit in that direction in Hungary. We're seeing moves in that direction in Russia. We mentioned it a little bit earlier in Egypt. So it's another area of concern. It's another area where we could do with a bit of a collection of views about what's happening. We've got a question from the US I can see just further up, or Canada maybe. Melanie, about what should we be talking to the panel companies about, or the survey exchanges?
Yeah, I definitely think that buyers, and whether they're brand side buyers or agency side buyers, or whoever the buyers are, they should absolutely be talking with their sample partners about what their processes are for gaining consent. Everyone in the ecosystem, even with this intermediation, is partly responsible for making sure that we do this well, and that we don't break laws or codes of ethics. And so I absolutely think that buyers should be familiarizing themselves with the rules and asking themselves, okay, if I'm doing something with a population under 16 or under 13, have I gone to my partners and said, talk to me about your process? Is it legal? Is it following the rules of local associations and the codes of ethics? Because you're both responsible in the end. If something goes wrong, everyone will be held accountable for their portion of responsibility in a flawed research project. So great question, and everyone in the ecosystem is responsible for the work done. And then I see a couple of other questions here that are for the U.S., but I don't think they came all the way through. So if people want to put a little bit more in the Q&A or restate their question, I see one that starts with an alarming emergency psychotic incidents. I think what they're going at is there's some mental illness issues and anxiety issues And those can affect the way that people answer surveys, and they can also have them fall into what would be considered a vulnerable individual status. And so while there are rules and laws about age, there are not as many rules and laws about vulnerable individuals, but there are ethical considerations, and they're included in the Insights Association Code, for example, as well as I know other codes. And we're responsible as researchers to do no harm to the vulnerable individuals, to consider what they can share without fear of reprisal, what they can share without fear of harm in any way, and what we even should consider asking them. So it's a great point that even outside of children, there are a lot of populations that we need to be careful with. While this specific session is about age, vulnerable individuals are so tethered to that it's a good reminder.
And I was just going to touch also that there are national associations that do have guidance in this area as well. In the UK, we have specific guidance on researching vulnerable adults, which covers all of the kind of ethical considerations that Melanie's been talking about. And also GRBN with Esomar, we also did a joint guideline on research with children and vulnerable adults that it's also worth having a look at as well, because that kind of takes much of the broader picture. Obviously is not tethered to specific local conditions, but has some good general principles that you might find helpful.
So jumping to another question, how do you deal with such issues where there are no explicit local national laws governing the issues? So the first thing would be to have a look and see if there's a national association. And we've got 37 indications here of who the national associations are. There will often be more. In the absence of that, then I would probably say, if we're talking just about age, use the ICC Esomar code, but always look to see if there is a national code, because it often has a higher age limit. So please, please, please do find out from the local associations.
And I was going to say, Ray, the other thing that would be useful in those situations is the GRBN and Esomar joint guidance on researching children, which actually provides some good ethical principles as well.
I think in terms of principles, the comment that I highlighted from the Thai Association of always making sure that the child consents as well as the adult, you kind of go, of course, but unless you note these things down, it doesn't always happen.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. In the absence of local guidance on when you can work with children, the best option is almost always to just work through the parents and get explicit informed consent from the parent and then explicit informed consent from the child. And when you have both of those in place, they'll almost always cover you.
I think you're right.
As we talked about early, that explicit informed consent is really important.
Yes.
There's a question here about
Yes.
There's a question here about should we show them our survey? And I think, while you probably can't show them the full survey, you certainly can write a really good summary or speak to a really good summary of the study's objectives and why you're doing it. Sorry, Ray and Debrah, I think you're both going to say something.
I've lost my thread. It's okay. It'll come back to me because we've got another interesting question, a sensitive topic. So this is guidance from the Insights Association about gender. There's also guidance from Esomar on gender and sexual orientation. And that will be a very sensitive question in some countries. And in fact, you do not want to collect information which could be potentially harmful to somebody if they gave you an answer. So that is one of the areas there where you want to be aware. If you're not in Kansas, as they say in The Wizard of Oz, check what the rules are, because they will vary quite a lot. So asking gender, probably not too much of an issue when it's male and female, but we tend not to just ask male and female now. And that potentially becomes sensitive. So being careful.
And yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, it's a case of checking with the national associations. Some will have guidance like the Insights Association, like MRS in the UK. We've got guidance on things like gender, sexual orientation, physical, mental health conditions, ethnicity, and so on. But even if a national association hasn't specifically got guidance, there will be experts within the association that will be able to provide you on the ground knowledge about how to conduct these kind of sensitive topics in their countries. Because also things to be really careful of is that, you know, countries will have from France, for example. In France, it is illegal to ask about ethnicity. So you need to know that so that you don't design research that it's asking that kind of question. So it is kind of really sort of putting the patchwork together of information before you actually go out and do the data collection.
Right, and specific to the question about the Insights Association and the U.S. guidance on gender, there are two recommendations that we actually made, one of them being the most sort of widely accepted to all populations, and one of them being the most inclusive way to ask about gender identity. And the second one, the most inclusive way to ask about gender identity, probably does get into a bit of sensitive category. Now, remember, in the U.S., you can ask that kind of question under the age of to people 13 and over, and certainly to 16 and over. And so, you know, if you're asking younger populations that kind of a question, it probably does merit some consideration, and you should have a conversation with the Insights Association and let us give you some additional specific guidance.
Absolutely. So just jumping back to the one that has slipped my mind, it's a very good point to say if you're interviewing children, then you should be thinking about this and thinking about this. It becomes more complex if you're in a country where 18-year-olds are unambiguously adults, and you're thinking of doing your interviewing in, say, Singapore, where they're not adult until they're 21. So as well as children, we have young people. And the wording of the question and a lot of the process was about this issue. It's not just children, it's children and young people, and the rules vary, and you could be quite surprised at how high that is in some countries and how low it is in some countries. What we deem to be an adult and for what purposes changes dramatically within and between countries.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
There's a question about Turkey. We invited something like 65, 70 associations. These are the responses we've got so far. Quite possibly there will be more responses coming in. So obviously it would be great to have more countries.
Yeah, there's a question here, Ray, about in what industries is synthetic data being adopted, and what are the most prevalent uses? From my seat, and I certainly invite Ray and Debrah to have a point of view on this, it's less about what industries are using synthetic data and more about what types of projects are using synthetic data right now. And that comes down to the training data set that is being used to inform the synthetic data. From where I sit, the synthetic data is being used for things like persona-based chat GPT in order to create some synthetic data because of the really large persona-based data sets that exist for some of these companies that do persona work. And then it's being used for some high-level ad testing because, again, the very large ad testing data sets that exist. Now, there's some research being done currently around not only accuracy, but precision, and how accurate and precise is the data when you start doing the cuts. But right now where we're seeing synthetic data being used is mostly in certain project types where really good large amounts of reliable representative data can build a really good training data set. That training data set is so important to having synthetic data that has good utility.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Melanie. Yeah, I'm very much the same in terms of the perspective from the UK. Things like personas is the area where there's been a lot of discussion about how synthetic data is being used. Looking at sectors from an MRS perspective, we have noticed that the health sector, pharma, has been using synthetic data for a slightly longer time. And I think this has a lot to do with about protecting vulnerable participants. So certain sectors are the attractiveness of synthetic data is it means that they don't need to potentially over research what could be a relatively small group of their customers to understand things like vulnerable needs or children needs. And so using synthetic data based upon the data from their customer base in those kind of communities has been a way that some healthcare organisations have gone. For those that are interested, MRS did a report on the usage of synthetic data as we've been seeing it, which is available from the MRS website. It's open. It's available to anyone who wishes to look at it. So, and that includes a series of case studies of how synthetic data has been used based upon members of the MRS. So people might find that useful as a document to have a look over.
So the one that I've seen that comes closest to an area of concern is, again, in the personas area, but where people are creating personas directly from Gemini, Claude, ChatGPT, and so on. So I want you to create 5 personas that are typical of teenagers in New York, because we want to talk, and then we will, how attractive would they find this idea, and so on. So this is coming straight from there, from the untrained or pre-trained. Pre-trained is a better way of explaining it, rather than specifically trained. I think what both Melanie and Debrah were talking about was specifically trained. So this is from the general pre-trained, and people are creating personas, which they're then saying, how would they respond to this? How would they respond to that? Of course, if you make a set of personas about teenagers in New York, you do not know that the data that was used to learn from came from teenagers or people in New York. But it does raise that ethical issue. What would go a little bit further and say, okay, if we wanted to get more underage people drinking, how would we do it? Is not ethical, but it's something which the software would do. And that raises problematic issues. I mean, I would think, and I'm thinking on the hoof here, which is always dangerous for those of us in trade associations, if you wouldn't ask it to a real person, you shouldn't probably ask it to a synthetic one.
I totally agree. The idea that having synthetic data is somewhat a way of kind of escaping laws and escaping ethics to be able to do, if you like, things that you can't do with primary data is completely wrong. We, you know, at the end of the day, the reason why we have professional codes, whether it's the ICC Esomar code, the Insights Association's code, MRS's code, or whatever, is that we are setting the guardrails for the profession. We're setting out the ethical rules that are required in order to be a member of the profession and to protect the profession, because it should be remembered that people can live long and happy lives never taking part in research. You know, we trust that the confidence in people to take part and support the work that we do. And the reason why we have that trust is because we have ethics and codes and we're recognized as a profession. As soon as we start to push those boundaries or to go over those boundaries and to do things that we would never have done before because we would have considered them unethical, we are certainly going down a pathway that could lead to a very different kind of sector into the future.
Right, I think that is probably all of the questions. So big thank you to my fellow presenters, Debrah and Melanie. Big thank you to all of you. Just a quick reminder that you will be getting access to the recording of this. And thank you for all the questions. So thank you, everybody.
And if you haven't noticed, the link to the guidance is in the chat. If you haven't noticed, the link to the guidance is in the chat, and we'll make it available to you as well in the emailed follow-up.
Absolutely. Thanks, Debrah and Melanie.
Thanks, Ray. Thanks, Debrah. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.